Hello and welcome to this Philbert Flies review of Aerosoft's Zagreb airport scenery for Microsoft Flight Simulator. You join me on approach to runway 22, and as always I'm starting with an approach to give you a look at the surrounding area and the opportunity to gauge the performance of the add-on on my system. My system specs and MSFS graphics settings are in the video description down below. I'll leave you to watch the landing in peace, and I'll speak to you again when we're parked up at a gate. From there, we'll have a good look around the airport together in different weather and lighting conditions, and I'll finish up by giving you my overall opinion on it. Welcome to Zagreb. We're parked here at stand Echo 6, and we're going to start by having a look at the jetway connecting to the aircraft. They are pretty slow moving here compared with what you might be used to, but they do a reasonably good job of connecting up. Little bit of a gap between the jetway floor and the aircraft, but the hood doesn't go through the aircraft skin, and overall it looks pretty good. Custom model jetways here, and they look pretty good to me. As we move along, you'll notice a few nice little details along the jetway, such as the wording on here, some weathered textures, a nice red cable here, air conditioning units. They look very nice indeed. Moving on now to the passenger terminal, you'll notice that we have a huge amount of transparent glass and a modelled interior. But before we look at that, let's focus on the outside. So this is a really interesting building with a complex curved roof that Aerosoft have done a great job of modelling. Very few jagged edges, maybe one or two that you can just see over here on some of these curves, but overall I'd say this is a pretty impressive piece of modelling. Down at ground level we've got some rather nice texture work. These vents look very realistic. The doors are pretty good. As you get super close there's a little bit of blurriness, but overall the texture resolution is pretty high and looks very, very good from the cockpit of an aircraft. Moving inside now, we'll start with this ground floor over here. Nice tinted glass, which retains its tint from the inside, which is nice to see. Now, there isn't a huge amount of detail in here. The seats are black, there's no texture to them, which is a little bit of a shame, but the floor looks good, the ceiling looks good, and overall I'm not too bothered by super high detailed interiors. As long as they look good from the outside, I'm happy, and this one certainly does. And as you can see, the upper levels are much the same. Not a huge amount of detail, but just enough to make it look realistic from outside. And to be fair, it doesn't look too bad from the interior either. These staircases on the outside of the jetways look absolutely fantastic. As you know, I'm a fan of high quality fencing, and while this probably couldn't quite be classed as fencing, it's a similar material, and to me it looks very good and adds to the immersion. This passenger terminal is at the eastern end of the airport, and we're going to head west now to have a look at this slightly larger apron west. The eastern part of Apron West is the cargo ramp essentially, and we've got a good amount of ground clutter to bring this to life. As we move over to look at some of the buildings, you'll notice that these are not done to quite the same standard as the passenger terminal, but they still look pretty good. So while we don't have transparent glass, we do have some pretty crisp textures which look very realistic. There are, however, one or two exceptions to this, as you will see here. Some slight blurriness around the door on this warehouse. But there are some really nice details included. I love the rusty corrugated iron roof here, and I love the amount of clutter. We have a 3D fire engine outside the fire station here, and that's a really nice model. And the opaque window textures here are obviously not as impressive as the transparent glass on the terminal, but they look pretty realistic to me. As we carry on moving west, the level of detail continues to impress me. I particularly like this terrace area here, and the detail in the wooden textures is particularly nice. Very detailed air conditioning pipes on the roof here, and some really nice three-dimensional signage here. And once again, a good amount of ground clutter. And at the far western end of the apron, we have the general aviation apron, with some static aircraft, as you can see. And once again, this looks pretty nice. In between the east and west aprons, we have this military apron, and as you can see, we've got some static military aircraft which look very nice indeed. And once again, the buildings have been modelled and textured very nicely. Heading back towards the runway and the main part of the airport from the military apron, we have the maintenance area. And it's really nice to see some static airliners here, in my opinion. We don't have airliners taking up gate space, but we do, as you've seen, have static aircraft in other areas where there's less likely to be space constraints. Now, the quality of the hangars over here is perhaps not as high as that of the buildings we've seen so far. There are some jagged edges, they're not quite as smooth and finessed as the other buildings, but they still look pretty reasonable, with some nice weathered textures. The ground textures at this airport have been very nicely done. They match the real airport perfectly according to the Bing satellite imagery. There's a good amount of rubber marking and dirt around the aircraft stands and in other areas where you would expect to find it. And they're nice and high resolution, so you won't notice any blurriness while you're taxiing along. They've done a good job of toning down the red markings as well, which often stick out like a sore thumb in add-on airports. The same is true of the green markings, but I have to say the yellow lines are a little bit too bright in comparison with the rest of the markings, and it would have been nice to see these toned down a little bit and perhaps made to look a tiny bit dirtier. The taxiways look good, as do the grassy areas, although the boundary between the two does look a little bit jagged in places. The 3D taxiway signs are nice and clear and easy to read, and they look very realistic. The runway in general looks very, very nice. The markings are accurate, the font used for the numbers matches the real airport very closely, and the materials used are accurate as well. There is a transition from concrete slabs up at this end to what I assume is poured tarmac and concrete or something like that here, so that's accurate. There's a good amount of rubber marking around the touchdown zone, which looks very realistic as well. The only part of this that I'm not so keen on is the harsh transition between this lighter texture on the outside and the darker texture towards the centre. Now, if you look at the satellite imagery, you'll notice that there is a change here, but it's not quite as pronounced as this, and it just makes it look slightly unrealistic in my opinion. But overall, as I say, a very good job. The landside parts of the airport have been very nicely done. As you can see, there's a huge amount of detail, parked up vehicles, ground clutter, and an elevated roadway which has been nicely modelled and textured. Transparent glass has been used on the front of the terminal, and if anything, the quality of the modelling inside this part of the airport is even better than what we saw on the airside part. Moving away from the building, you'll notice a car park complete with more modelled cars, and we've even got some planting around the edge of it. It looks very convincing. And a similar level of detail has been included up on the old western part of the airport. Again, we've got properly textured roadways, which is really nice to see, good fencing, and some vehicles parked up outside the old terminal building as well. The airport looks really very good indeed by night. Really convincing flood lighting across the apron, and the terminal interior looks great from the outside as well. Those of you who like to start your flights from inside the terminal building or end them here will be pleasantly surprised, I think. It looks very, very realistic inside here by night, and I love the way the lights reflect off this metallic roof. The west apron looks really good as well, and even the windows that feature opaque textures instead of transparent glass look pretty realistic. And the taxiway and runway lighting looks great as well. Here's Zagreb in the rain. The ground textures look fantastic when they're wet, and the transparent window textures don't suffer from as much popping in poor visibility as some we've seen. Here's Zagreb in the snow, and I have to say it doesn't look hugely realistic. I quite like the covering of snow over the aircraft stands. I like the fact that there are little gaps in the coverage. It looks fairly realistic there, but I really don't like the sharp transition to this area where there is no snow at all. Now, those of you who have been with Microsoft Flight Simulator for a while will probably know that the level of snow coverage is down to the colour of the underlying texture, which makes it a very, very hard thing to do well. However, I have seen some careful blending around taxiway edges and other things like that that just make it look that little bit better. On the plus side, we do at least have a strip down the centre of this section of the runway which doesn't have any snow on it, and this is preferable in my opinion to arriving at an airport with only the lights showing through a thick blanket of snow. So what do I think of Aerosoft's Zagreb overall? Well, I'm really impressed with it. The things I've found to criticise, the colour of some of the runway textures, the snow, and the brightness of the yellow taxiway lines, pale into insignificance compared with the good points. The airport has been beautifully built. It has accurate and crisp ground and building textures, high quality modelling, a good amount of ground clutter, and a super detailed landside area. The night lighting is absolutely fantastic too. All of this comes together to create a very immersive atmosphere, and I'm confident that this is an airport that most people will really enjoy flying to. That's it. I hope you found this review useful. If you have, do please click the thumbs up button and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon here on Philbert Flies. Bye bye.